You know, there is something rather peculiar that happens in the moment before an empath disappears. And most people do not notice it when it happens. There is no argument, no ultimatum, no breakdown. It comes on an ordinary evening, quietly, like a decision that has already been made somewhere deeper than words. And then it is simply clear that something is over. By the time you notice the silence, the decision was already made months ago. This is what nobody tells you. You cannot watch this kind of leaving happen. There is no single moment to point to. You only understand it later looking back, when you realize that the genuine attention they used to bring had already been gone longer than you knew. The conversations had become lighter without you noticing why. They were still showing up, still responding, still keeping the shape of the relationship. But the real part of them had already stepped back. You felt it as a vague sense that something was off, even if you could not name it. What was off was all of them. Let me clear something up because this misunderstanding matters. These people are not fragile. The word empath gets used so casually that it has come to mean someone easily hurt, someone who needs careful handling. That is not what I am talking about. I am talking about someone who simply picks up more than most people do. They notice when your tone does not match your words. They sense the tension in a room before anyone names it. They hear what you are not saying as clearly as what you are. This is not something they practice. It is just how they work. And that kind of awareness runs all the time. Every conversation, every relationship passes through it fully. So when a person like this finally pulls back, that choice carries real weight. It did not happen quickly. It happened after a long period of carrying things no one saw, extending patience that was never acknowledged, and finding generous explanations for behavior that did not deserve one. Let me tell you about the first thing that happens, long before the quiet. The empath keeps returning. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has no name in ordinary language. It is the exhaustion of the person who has tried to explain themselves so many times, in so many different ways, that they have begun to lose faith not in the other person, but in language itself. What pushes these people away is almost never the big moment. It is rarely a serious betrayal or a bad fight. Those things are at least visible. What slowly wears a perceptive person down is a long series of small moments, each one too minor to raise, each one easy to dismiss as overthinking, but each one carrying the same message. And that message, repeated enough times, becomes impossible to ignore. The message is simply, what you feel does not matter here. It usually starts with something small, a joke about how intense they are, or a comment about how they make things heavier than they need to be. And when something shifts in their expression, you wave it away. You were just joking. Surely they are not really bothered. So they smile and say nothing, because they have already learned that saying something only becomes more evidence for the case against them. So they put it away and move on. Then something quieter happens. They tell you something real, something it took courage to say. Maybe that they have been feeling a distance between you, and you, without meaning to cause harm, make it smaller. You tell them they are reading too much into it. You think you are reassuring them. What you are actually doing is telling them that their experience cannot be trusted. For someone who moves through life by trusting exactly that, it does not feel like a small thing. Then comes the reversal. They say clearly that something is hurting them. And within minutes, somehow, the conversation turns. Now they are managing your reaction to what they just said. They are apologizing for how they brought it up. And by the end, their original pain is gone from the room. They had opened a door. They will not open it again. So when they go quiet, you must understand what has actually happened. They have not calmed down. They have not let it go. They have simply stopped believing that their words can reach you. I once knew a man, quiet, thoughtful, the kind of person who remembered things. If you mentioned in passing that you were nervous about a meeting, he would ask you about it 3 days later. If you were having dinner with 6 people, and one person at the table was struggling to be heard, he was the one who created the space for them to finish their thought. People loved being around him. They felt seen in his presence in a way that was difficult to explain to someone who had not experienced it. He had been with the same woman for 7 years. She was not a bad person. She was bright and charming. And when things were good between them, she was genuinely wonderful. But there was a pattern that had established itself so gradually that neither of them had ever named it. Whenever she was upset, the room reorganized around her upset. The conversation would shift toward her. His concerns from earlier in the day would quietly disappear, because managing her emotional state required his full attention. If he raised something difficult, she would become hurt in a way that required him to spend the next hour reassuring her that he had not meant it the way it sounded, until by the end of the conversation he had apologized for bringing up the thing that had actually hurt him. He would go to bed, having comforted her for his own pain. He tried to bring it up, once, carefully. He chose a calm evening. He said, "I have been feeling like, when I am upset, it does not quite land the same way as when you are." She looked at him. She said, "I cannot believe you are making this about you right now." And he apologized. He told no one else. He did not post about it. He did not call a friend. He sat with it, the way he had learned to sit with all of it, quietly, turning it over in his mind at 3 a.m, looking for the most generous interpretation of her behavior, finding it, filing the wound, and going on. 18 months later, he told her he was leaving. She was stunned. She said everything had been fine. He nodded. He said, "I know it seemed that way." He could not explain to her that it had not been fine for a very long time, because nothing that had happened had been dramatic enough to point to. There was no incident. There was only the accumulation of 1,000 small moments, each too subtle to name, each carrying the same message, until his nervous system had drawn a conclusion that no apology was going to revise. The second thing is that their silence is not absence, it is return. When the deeply feeling person stops trying to reach you, they do not empty out. They do not become less. If anything, the silence makes them more themselves than they have been in years, because the enormous energy they were spending trying to be understood is suddenly available for something else. It turns inward. It becomes self-directed in a way that feels almost like relief, or would feel like relief, if the grief were not also present. They begin to remember things they had set aside, preferences they had softened to avoid conflict, opinions they had qualified so heavily that the original thought disappeared inside the qualifications, needs they had learned to classify as excessive because the person they were with seemed wearied by them. In the silence, all of this returns. Quietly, the way color returns to something that has been held too long in the shade and finally brought back into the light. This is not selfishness. It is recovery. The empath has been living at a slight angle to themselves for however long the reaching went unanswered, tilted toward the other person in a constant gesture of offering that was never quite received. When they straighten up, when they stop leaning, it looks from the outside like withdrawal. But from the inside, it is something else entirely. It is the rediscovery of their own center. And this is precisely why the silence means it is already over. Because once a person who feels deeply has found their way back to themselves, they do not easily agree to abandon it again. The silence is not a negotiating position. It is a homecoming. And you cannot ask someone to leave home simply because your comfort requires their homelessness. The third thing is that they have already grieved. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand and the one most likely to be missed. By the time the empath goes quiet, the grief has already happened. Not publicly, not in ways that would have made it legible to anyone else, but in private, in the middle of the night, in the way they stared out windows when they thought no one was watching, in the careful manner with which they stopped letting themselves hope for certain things. The empath grieves in advance. They feel the shape of a loss long before it arrives in the form that others can recognize. They have known for some time what the situation actually is, even as they kept trying to make it into something else. The silence is not the beginning of the end. The silence is what comes after the end has already been understood and mourned, and finally accepted. This is why, when the quiet person is confronted with alarm, with sudden attention, with the question, "Where did you go?" their response is so unsatisfying to the person asking. They do not erupt. They do not pour out the long accumulated list of grievances. They simply look at you with a kind of careful steadiness and say something that sounds like a small thing, but is not a small thing at all. Something like, "It's fine," or "I'm just tired," or nothing at all, because the argument they needed to have was not had when it could have changed something. It is too late now for the argument to change anything. After that, from the outside, nothing looks different. They are still there, still warm, still showing up. But something has reorganized internally. They stop bringing you the things that actually matter to them. The idea they were excited about. The worry they have not told anyone. The small private things that require real trust to share. Those things get quietly redirected. They go somewhere you no longer have access to. The relationship continues, sometimes for months, like this. Present on the surface, already over underneath. The fourth thing is that silence, for an empath, is a boundary. And it is the last one. These people have tried every other kind of boundary first. The gentle request, the clear statement, the reluctant ultimatum they immediately softened because they could not bear to deliver it with the force it actually required. They have drawn lines and then moved them, because moving them felt, in the moment, like love. And perhaps it was love. But love that consistently overrides its own limits, teaches the other person that the limits are not real, that if enough pressure is applied, or enough time passes, or enough charm is deployed, the line will shift again. And so the empath is left having communicated through years of softening that their needs are negotiable, that their discomfort is temporary, that they will return to the work of the relationship, regardless of whether the work is shared, until they stop returning. The silence is the boundary that cannot be walked back because it is not a declared boundary. It is not a rule that can be argued with, or a line that can be moved through persuasion. It is simply the cessation of reaching. And you cannot negotiate with a person who has stopped reaching because there is nothing to push against. The silence offers no resistance and therefore cannot be overcome by force. This is the final protection of a person who has run out of softer protections. This is why people are always shocked later. When the distance finally becomes impossible to ignore, everyone says there were no signs. But there were signs. There were many of them. They were just internal. And nobody was paying attention to the internal. Because by the time a person like this stops confiding in you, the decision is already done. What follows is not a choice. It is just the quiet completion of something already decided. The fifth thing, and the one that matters most, is this. The silence carries a question that was never asked in words. Underneath every conversation the empath tried to have, underneath every letter written and every concern raised, and every gentle attempt to make themselves understood, there was a question that was never stated plainly, because stating it plainly felt too vulnerable. Merged. The question was not about any particular issue or incident. The question was simply this: do I matter to you in the specific, attentive way that I am trying to matter to you? Not in a general sense. Not in the way that people matter by default to those who share their lives, but in the particular way. The way that means you notice when I am different from yesterday. The way that means my interior world is genuinely interesting to you. The way that means you would notice if I stopped speaking. Not after a month, immediately. They never asked this question plainly, because the answer they feared was not the harsh answer. The answer that says, of course you matter. While the hands that say it have no idea what you actually feel, what you actually think, who you actually are, beneath the version of yourself that is convenient and easy and does not require sustained attention. When the empath goes quiet, they have received their answer, not in words, in the long accumulation of moments when the question could have been answered and wasn't. And the quietness that follows is not bitterness, though bitterness passed through on its way. It is something more complete. It is the peace of a person who has stopped waiting for something that is not coming, who has redirected their considerable capacity for attention toward themselves, who has decided finally that they are worth the same care they were offering. Now something needs to be said to both sides of this. To the person watching someone withdraw, you probably did not intend any of this. That may well be true, but intention is not the same as impact. You can damage someone's trust in their own perception without ever deciding to. The effect on them is the same either way. Their experience does not register your intentions. It registers what kept happening. The window to change something is smaller than most people think. And what keeps it open is not a big gesture or a long conversation. What keeps it open is what you do in the next ordinary moment. When they say something real, and your first instinct is to dismiss it, and you do not. You stay, you ask, you let what they are saying exist in the room without immediately making it smaller. That is what actually helps. Nothing else comes close. To the person who recognizes themselves in this, the one who has been quietly withdrawing, filing things away, processing alone at 3 a.m, what you are carrying is not proof that you are too much. It is proof of how long you have been doing this without anyone noticing. The listening, the translating, the managing of everyone else's emotional state while your own goes unacknowledged. You have been doing that work for a long time, and it has cost you something real. It has cost you the simple experience of being in a space where your inner world is treated as something worth hearing. What then is the meaning of all this? Not for the empath, who already knows what it means, but for anyone standing on the other side of the silence, wondering when it arrived and why they did not notice sooner. The meaning is not a verdict on your character. It is not a judgment. Deeply feeling person who has gone quiet is not punishing you. They are, in their particular way, being honest with you in the only language they have left. The silence is the truth of the situation, expressed without accusation. If you are hearing this and recognizing someone in your own life, someone who used to press gently on the difficult things and lately has stopped, someone whose warmth has not disappeared but has turned inward, someone who smiles at your stories without quite arriving in the room, then understand what you are seeing. You are seeing a person who has used up their store of hope for something specific. Not hope in general. They have not become hopeless, but the particular hope that kept them speaking. The hope that the door they kept knocking on would eventually open from the other side. That hope is gone. And it did not go because they are weak. It went because they are honest. And honesty in a person built the way they are built is not something they can argue themselves out of. They feel the truth before they can explain it. And once they have felt it clearly enough, they stop pretending they have not. The silence is not a weapon. It is not a test. It is not a phase that patience will dissolve. It is a person who loved with everything they had, tried with everything they had, and finally, quietly, choose themselves. So when I say that when an empath goes quiet, it is already over, I am describing a simple, cold reality of human energy. It is over because the bridge that held you together was built entirely of the empath's energy. Their constant explaining, their endless translating, and their stubborn hope that you would finally see them. When they go quiet, it isn't a strategy or a test. It is the sound of that bridge finally collapsing because the architect has simply stopped rebuilding it. They have realized that their presence is a gift that requires a witness. And without one, the gift is eventually withdrawn. For the empath, this isn't the tragedy. It is the moment they stop being a ghost in your life and start being a person in their own. And for you, the observer, the lesson is absolute. If you do not offer your presence when someone is still trying to reach you, you will eventually find yourself speaking to an empty room. Not because they are angry, but because the person you knew is simply no longer there. The debt is settled, the energy is gone, and the silence is the only truth that remains. The game is finished. The theater is empty. It is over.